Hello, Internet.
Jordan here from Arrow to the Mead. Today, we're going to be doing part 2 of my experiment trying to figure out, is it possible to ruin your mead by pitching too much yeast? Let's get to it. Last time we left off with 3 different buckets, each of which had 1.25 gallons of the same clover honey traditional must, starting at 1054 original gravity. They were given the same nutrient schedule, and the only difference between them is how much yeast I pitched to start fermentation. One had 2.5 grams, one had 25 grams, and the other had the entire rest of the 500 gram brick I started with, somewhere in the neighborhood of 470 grams. Over the first couple of days, primary pretty much went as you would expect. The 2.5 gram bucket fermented, like most fermentations would go. The 25 gram bucket fermented, like most fermentations would go, but faster. And the 470 gram bucket fermented stupid fast. It plummeted, gravity plummeted like a lead weight on that one, all the way down to 1016, which is kind of insane over just a couple of days. But the next reading, things started to get a little interesting. The 2.5 and the 25 gram buckets pretty much stayed the course. The difference between them and the rate at which they were fermenting looked like it was staying roughly the same to me. And the 25 gram bucket was even almost dry, dropped to about 1.001. But the overloaded bucket looked like it was stalling out. It only dropped a few points in between this and the previous reading, and the 25 gram bucket had actually surpassed it by a significant margin at that. And the 2.5 gram bucket even had almost caught up to it. This trend only got worse as time went on. By the next gravity reading, both of the other buckets had gone dry, 1.000, but the overloaded bucket had only dropped a single additional point, which is quite easily within the margin of error for me trying to read my hydrometer. I decided to let these sit for a while before taking another reading. I could potentially have managed to kick fermentation on that 470 gram bucket, but I didn't really want to introduce additional variables. It was clear at this point that neither of the other buckets were gonna need additional nutrients, and on top of that, it was pretty clear to me that the overloaded bucket wasn't gonna need any more fermento, for example. Yeast hulls and stuff like that are a source of organic nitrogen. They essentially are a nutrient in their own right, and there was tons of that in the overloaded bucket. So I decided just to leave it be for a while and then come back and see how it was coming along. My next reading was over a week later. The 2.5 and 25 gram buckets had actually both dropped even further, below dry, 0.998. But the 470 gram bucket still had not moved one iota. With only a single point drop over the last 12 days and no gravity movement at all within the last 9 days, figured it was plenty safe to call the overload bucket stuck and everything ready to rack. I went in ascending order, so I started with the 2.5 gram bucket first. And before I actually did the racking, I wanted to take a quick look at the mead in the bucket to see what it looks like. This 2.5 gram batch was quite clear. You could see straight through to the bottom. You could see all the texture in the lees, and there weren't any obvious floaters or anything cloudy like that. So I got to sanitizing my gear, and then I started racking. After which I pulled a little taster, which was plenty easy to do as I had more product than would actually fit in the 1 gallon carboy. Remember, I started with about 1.25 gallons on each of these batches to make sure that I could fill up 1 gallon carboy without any headspace issues. And it's about this point where I start doing the tasting that I slowly realize I made this with a clover honey, and I've never actually done a clover honey traditional before. I was a little bit confused about the tang and tartness that I was picking up, but I think it's a combination of the clover honey itself and the CO2 that was still in solution in these. I think they needed to off-gas quite a bit. You can actually see how much active bubbling I'm getting right after racking into the carboy in this shot here. So yeah, initially slightly confused about the taste, but then I remembered what honey I used, and I saw how much CO2 was coming out of solution, and I decided the 2.5 gram batch was pretty much tasting how I expected it to taste at this point in time. Onto the 25 gram bucket, I started the same way, by just taking a look into the bucket. What does this mead look like? And it was very close to the 2.5 gram bucket. There were a couple floaters here and there, some yeast rafts, I think. But for the most part, it was clear. I could see straight to the bottom. I could see the texture of the lees. I might give an ever so slight edge to the 2.5 gram bucket on the clarity front, but they're comparable. I then sanitized, racked, and pulled a taster, which again was not a problem because I started with 1.25 gallons in primary and I had more product than was going to fit in my gallon carboy. On the taste test itself, I thought I could pick up just a slightly perceptible amount of yeast in the nose. which was not necessarily fantastic, but only just barely. On the taste, however, it actually did taste a little smoother to me. I might be biased because it's not a blind taste test I'm doing here, but it kind of tasted like it fermented cleaner. So these two are definitely tasting similar at this point in time. If I were to actually do a blind taste test, I suspect I would struggle a little bit to differentiate between them. But when it's not blind, I would say, given the way that these presented currently, I would give a slight edge on the aroma to the 2.5 gram batch and a slight edge on the taste to the 25 gram batch. If I had to pick between one of them, I actually slightly favor the 25 gram batch, but these are very close and very comparable. We're talking small differences here. I then moved on to the overload bucket, which was not in any way, shape, or form even remotely a little bit clear. It was a mess. The bottom of the bucket was not remotely visible, and there were yeast rafts everywhere. Frankly, it still looked like it was actively fermenting, but I had gone well over a week without any change in gravity, so as crazy as it looked, it seemed like it was time to rack it. So I sanitized my gear and got this sludge racked over into a carboy. Pulling a taste tester was not quite as easy on this one as it was on the others because there was such a ridiculously large amount of sludge, really, left behind in the bucket that I actually didn't have enough to fill up the carboy all the way, even with a 1.25 gallon primary volume. I didn't have a full, nice headspace level in the gallon carboy in secondary. Luckily, it's still enough that I don't think it's going to be a problem. It's not like the carboy was only half full or anything, but I think it's worth pointing out here that when you overpitch your yeast by this much, you have significant, noticeable, tangible losses in your yields. In any case, when it came time for the taste test, I decided I wanted to spit it out. Look, I'm no expert on this, but I'm pretty sure it's not actually good for you to ingest this much live and active yeast. I don't think it'll kill you or anything, but as I understand it anyway, it could definitely make you sick, and I didn't really feel like getting sick. On the nose, I got old gym socks. I don't know what else to say about that. I didn't get alcohol. I didn't get sugar. I didn't get honey. I didn't get clover tang. I didn't get floral aromas. I got old sweaty gym socks. That's it.
Oh! That's so gross!
Curiously, all that yeasty aroma seems to be, packed into the aromas. So when I took a sip and just let it sit on my tongue, I didn't actually get that. It tasted okay, as long as it sat on my tongue. The second I spat, all of those aromas kind of got released again, and then it felt like the yeasty old gym sock was in my mouth, and it was horrible. That's easily, hands down, unequivocally the worst thing I've ever brewed. Please don't do this at home. Please, God, don't do this at home.
Oh, it's all in the aftertaste. Oh.
Also, if you don't listen to me and you brew this at home anyway, please don't drink it. Really, please don't drink it. One other thing I did was I took a look at the buckets here after racking to show you what was left behind, and I'll let Racking Day Jordan explain that to you.
As an additional final comparison here, I wanted to show you what all three of the lease layers left behind after racking look like. And as you can probably tell, there's a fairly minimal difference between the leftmost bucket, which is 2.5 grams, and the middle bucket, which is 25, but there is a significantly bigger and significantly darker layer on the right bucket, the danger or the overload bucket. And if we take a look inside of these, give them a little bit of a swirl, this is fairly fluid. It's clearly tan enough that there's a lot of lease in here. I wouldn't want to rack this, but it's fairly fluid. And pretty much the same thing here. There's probably more lease at the bottom that's not dissolved into the water, but for the most part, this is fluid. This one is just like, there's a little bit of fluid in there, but most of this is soup. Ugh. So, yeah.
And then the last thing I have to show you here is a quick clarity comparison of the three carboys after racking. The 2.5 gram bucket might be ever so slightly more clear than the 25 gram bucket, but they are very comparable, whereas you can't see even a little bit through the overload bucket. It's completely opaque. And I came back a few days later to see if things were getting any better. The overload bucket did look like it might be starting to stratify a little bit. The top, maybe third or so of the carboy is a slightly different color than the rest of it, and you are starting to get another sediment layer at the very bottom. But it's still clear as mud. When I started this project, I had plans to do a big blind taste test of some kind, maybe even with some friends to help me out and make sure that it's not just my bias. But at this point, I don't think it's necessary. Even without taste and smell directly accessible to you as a video viewer, I think it's probably pretty obvious that the overloaded bucket is gonna stick out like a sore thumb. The 2.5 and 25 gram batches did come out close enough that I think I might struggle to differentiate between them in a blind taste test setting, but that kind of proves my original hypothesis. If they are close enough that it's hard to tell, then overpitching by 10 times the amount that a lot of you would have pitched on a gallon batch doesn't ruin your mead. And even if I can tell the difference, I had a slight preference for the 25 gram batch, which also proves the point. Overpitching by 10 times doesn't ruin your mead. The only thing that would really matter is if I can identify the overloaded batch. And if you don't trust me to identify that monstrosity in a blind taste test compared to the other two, then you probably shouldn't be watching the channel because you clearly don't trust me at all. This is all to say, I think instead of a blind taste test, that the next steps would be either age or filtration. If you guys want to, I can leave this overloaded batch sitting, just to see how long it takes to start to clarify naturally and reach a drinkable state, if it ever does. Or I can try to filter this yeast out. Sterile filtering is, after all, designed to remove yeast so that you can have a stable mead to back sweeten. So in theory, if I put this through a pass of sterile filtration, it will take all of the yeast out. And since the yeast is the reason that this mead is completely undrinkable right now, it should, hypothetically, fix the mead. Let me know down in the comments which way you'd like to see me take this experiment. Do you want to see the age? Or do you want to see if I can mechanically fix this completely broken mead? And also, let me know if you'd like to see me do something similar. I originally thought that maybe I would do a escalation. I'll do the next one, instead of 500 grams, I'll do a whole kilogram of yeast and see what happens, but kind of don't think that's necessary either. I think we pretty much got it covered. But hey, maybe you want to see more granularity on the lower end. There is, after all, a pretty significant jump between 25 grams in a gallon and a quarter and 470 grams in a gallon and a quarter. If you want to see 100, I don't know. Let me know in the comments. In any case, this has been Jordan from Arrow to the Mead. Thank you for joining me, and have a good however long until I see you again.